Hello, welcome. You are listening to the very first episode of the Project 10 podcast series with myself, Cormac Moore. It's going to be a 10-part podcast series covering a variety of different topics, but the one thing we're talking about today is the idea of should we just finally legalise drugs across the board?
Drugs are bad.
And the argument that I wanted to look at in here today on this episode was not really because of recreational use or medicinal needs. I think we know the benefits certain drugs have to certain types of patients. But would legalising drugs help combat vicious, violent crime that is generally associated with an illicit drug? And to help us delve into that idea a little bit more, I'm speaking to some really interesting people that I think you're going to enjoy listening to, including this guy.
Oh, yeah, it was very dangerous. You know, at the height of the crack era in the 80s, there were over 2,000 homicides. Well, there was instances where I carried guns, actually shot someone, and it was just a very dangerous time. It was a dangerous time in New York City.
That's a man by the name of Cormac Pegues. He's a retired NYPD police chief who's just released a new book called Once a Cop, if you want to check it out. It's called Once a Cop, The Street, the Law, Two Worlds, One Man. I told him I'd totally plug it because he came on and gave up his time. But he started off life as a teenager selling drugs in New York City. And he's a fascinating individual, fascinating story. We're going to be going back in time and also seeing if we can draw any parallels between Prohibition-era America when we banned booze to what's actually happening today.
Violence, bribery, corruption. It was a real mess in the 1920s.
Irish economist and author Dave McWilliams will be coming on to give us the Irish take on the issue.
When Obama arrives, we give him a pint of stout. A lot of people say, you might as well give him a line of Coke. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's kind of ridiculous.
We're also going to be hearing from Dr Johnny Connolly from the Centre for Crime, Justice and Victim Studies, School of Law, Limerick University, about what the impact of violence has on the criminal organisations themselves.
Violence is not good for business. The violence that we're seeing at the moment in Dublin and in recent months, that's at a very high level, and it's possibly because it's family related, but in general, it's not in the interests of those at high levels in the drug trade for this to go on, because law enforcement, it attracts their attention, it attracts political priority, which it doesn't usually do.
So that's the question then here today. If we legalise drugs, are you going to do something significant to reduce the violence that takes place within these criminal organisations? Or are you just going to legitimise an illegal criminal gang, and are they continue to kind of going to use violence as a means of intimidation, as a means of keeping their market share? I mean, are they going to start hiring PR companies to do ad campaigns for them? But that's what we're going to try and find out here today. Would legalising it help? And the battle against drugs in modern times kind of has been spearheaded by the Americans. And numerous presidents have called on the public and have called on the resources of their governments to try and stamp out the problem of drugs. Turns out, though, it hasn't really worked out too well.
Which I think needs to be made to the nation. America's public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse. In order to fight and defeat this enemy, it is necessary to wage a new all-out offensive. I have asked the Congress to provide the legislative authority and the funds to fuel this kind of an offensive.
Drugs are menacing our society. They're threatening our values and undercutting our institutions. They're killing our children.
President George Bush addresses the nation with an outline of his national drug policy.
This is the first time since taking the oath of office that I felt an issue was so important, so threatening, that it warranted talking directly with you, the American people. All of us agree that the gravest domestic threat facing our nation today is drugs. Drugs have strained our faith in our system of justice. Our courts, our prisons, our legal system are stretched to the breaking point. The social costs of drugs are mounting. In short, drugs are sapping our strength as a nation.
So that was Nixon, Reagan and the first George Bush coming out declaring their own wars on drugs, which have cost millions and millions and hundreds of millions of dollars over the years. And since then, consumption in America and the drug market in America has grown to be worth over $100 billion each and every year. So it definitely has not done anything to stop consumption. And as we know, violence has increased with that as well. So has it worked? Doesn't look like it's worked. But what's worse and what's more stupid is we have already run this experiment of prohibition. And did prohibition work?
No, not really. Alcohol continued to flow freely in the underground economy or black markets. And so it didn't stop alcohol prohibition. It just ended up causing a series of negative, unforeseen consequences. Of course, now we can tell what would emerge in these black markets, but it actually made drinking less safe, more dangerous. There was all sorts of social problems, violence, bribery, corruption. It was a real mess in the 1920s. It's called the Roaring 1920s, and part of the reason was there was so much crime and violence and corruption going on throughout the United States.
Now that, by the way, is Dr. Mark Thornton, who did his PhD dissertation on the economics of the Prohibition era in the United States. So I spoke to him recently. I wanted to know what data we can look at from Prohibition era America. Specifically, what happened to crime rate when Prohibition was introduced?
Oh, yes. There's absolutely no doubt that crime increased. We see crime rates increasing in the United States in terms of property crime, violent crime, as well as corruption of the political process. I documented in my book that the murder rate in the United States was about 5 murders per 100,000 citizens before alcohol prohibition, and during alcohol prohibition it rose to almost 10 murders, or doubling of the murder rate in the United States. And then when alcohol prohibition went away in the early 1930s, even though we were in the Great Depression, the murder rate went right back down to 5 murders per 100,000. So, and then of course we saw prison overpopulation. The number of criminals in federal and state prisons increased dramatically, and they had to build a bunch of new prisons, basically. So crime was definitely rampant during alcohol prohibition, and it was because of alcohol prohibition.
Yeah, so it turns out prohibition didn't lead to very many good things. The murder rate doubled, more people were put in prison, but was there any positive benefits to prohibition, according to Mark and the research and the data that he's looked at?
Not really. A lot of consumption patterns changed. For example, the consumption of beer fell dramatically. The production and consumption of wine also fell dramatically. But the consumption of whiskey and gin and things of that nature increased dramatically. And some of those products actually were bottled and transferred from the producers to the consumers at twice the regular potency of vodka and gin and whiskey. So people were consuming alcohol products that were not commercially produced. And so they had many poisons and toxins in them. They didn't taste good. They were very highly potent. And so, there's really no benefit in there. It just switched from the low potency alcohol to high potency alcohol with a lot of toxins remaining in the product. And so the only one benefit that I found in my years of research was that the 1920s was the cocktail decade, when bartenders and speakeasies were creating, new forms of cocktails where they would mix in dairy products and fruit juices and sugar and all sorts of things to try to get the bad-tasting, foul-smelling spirit products, whiskey again, gin, vodka, so that they didn't smell and so that they could cover up the taste. And of course, all of those recipes, not all of them survived. There were hundreds and probably thousands of different cocktails that were made, but some of the best cocktails of that generation are still in use today.
So there you are now, cocktails. The one benefit from Prohibition era is your Long Island iced tea, your Sex on the Beach, and your Cosmopolitan. One of the things that they were trying to do in Prohibition era was obviously limit the supply of alcohol to the public in America. And when you limit the supply of something, you generally force up the price of it. And sometimes forcing up the price of an illegal addictive substances can lead to more criminal behaviour from addicts themselves, which Dr. Mark Thornton continues talking about here.
Oh, yes. I mean, it's not always the case, but like with heroin addiction, you're physically addicted to the product, and of course it's not commercially produced, so it's unstable, and you don't know what the potency is. But all of a sudden, if the government cracks down on it or are successful in stopping shipments at a particular point in time, the price rises very dramatically, and all of a sudden it really impinges upon the addict's budget, and so they reach out into the world of crime and do robberies and burglaries and prostitution and things of that nature in order to make up for that. The irony today in the United States is that we have hundreds of thousands of people addicted to prescription opiate drugs, and of course those prescriptions come to an end, and then those newly minted addicts of our medical sector, they have to go out and buy those pills on the black market, and when that impinges upon their budget, many have turned to illegal heroin as a low price substitute, because when they're not effectively cracking down on the heroin trade, the price of heroin actually goes pretty low. And so we have a sort of a reverse situation in the United States where thousands of people are dying from overdoses because they became addicted as a result of pain medication prescribed by doctors.
So that's one of the many ways that drugs can impact an individual's behaviour. But I wanted to ask Dr. Thornton what he thought were some of the lasting impacts in America that came after the Prohibition era.
Well, there's a lot of long-term negative effects of Prohibition. Certainly, it's created an undercurrent in society where you have black markets and you have organized crime in the U.S. And so all of the primary early organized crime organizations started during alcohol prohibition. They were built on the profits of alcohol prohibition. And of course, once alcohol prohibition was ended on a nationwide basis, those organizations, those family mafia type organizations, continued on in other areas of prohibition, such as gambling and prostitution and illegal drugs. And so, that's part of the whole underground economy and black markets, is that organized crimes rise up in order to distribute these illegal products. And organized crime is the ones that actually bribe our politicians and judges and law enforcement, creating a corrupt criminal justice system basically in the United States. And in return for bribes, of course, the law enforcement and district attorneys and judges don't go after the organized crime families, and they actually go after the competitors of those organized crime families. So it's created a more or less permanent system of organized crime that does have a very negative effect on our criminal justice system.
So we're going to find out a little bit later on what Dr. Thornton thinks we should do about the issue of legalising drugs. But he'd been speaking a lot about the crime rates, the impact criminal organisations can have on the legal system, and I wanted to find someone who used to be involved in that world. And as I mentioned at the start of the episode, I came across this guy.
My name is Pegues. I'm the former commanding officer of the 67th Precinct in East Flatbush, Brooklyn. I'm a retired police officer. I did 21 years of service. I retired in 2013. I rose through the ranks pretty quickly and have a book out right now called Once a Cop, The Street, the Law, Two Worlds, One Man.
Fascinatingly interesting individual. His life when he started out as a teenager was in a completely different world.
Yes, well, I started selling drugs at the age of 13. I started selling marijuana. I started selling loose marijuana. As a matter of fact, when I was that young, I didn't really think I was doing anything that bad because there was a lot. Everybody was smoking marijuana.
So just a familiar story, no matter what part of the world you're from. Deprived background, looking for money, and if everyone else is doing it, sure, why not? But he quickly graduated from selling marijuana to a lot of heavier stuff.
Okay, so what happened was we started selling marijuana, and I actually graduated from marijuana to mescaline tabs. Those are pills, and I was selling loose cocaine, cocaine what people snort. And then around in the 80s, crack cocaine hit the United States, and then I had to start selling crack. I started selling crack cocaine. Once we graduated to the flipped over and went and started selling crack cocaine, I mean, the money was coming hand over fist. I was making $2,000 a day easily. And, I had a crew, a main crew, it was like 5 of us, and we always making a couple $1,000. That's how big crack became in our community. I like to always say, if you hang around, Wall Street people, you're going to probably go on Wall Street and sell stocks. I hung around with drug dealers and gangsters. And so it was inevitable for me to gravitate toward that experience.
And as you can imagine, selling crack cocaine in the 80s wasn't the safest profession to be in.
Oh, yeah, it was very dangerous. At the height of the crack era in the 80s, the mid to late 80s, there were over 2,000 homicides in the city alone. It was very dangerous. As I write in my book, there was instances where I carried guns, actually shot someone. It's in the book. And it was just a very dangerous time. It was a dangerous time in New York City. So, and I'm not condoning what I did and my friends did, but we didn't even realize it was that dangerous for what we was doing.
So what was his turning point? He went from making thousands of dollars a day to dropping it all, joining the military and winding up in the NYPD.
I knew all along that what I was doing was wrong. Even when you read in the book, you'll see more realistically I was fighting with what I was doing. I knew it was wrong to carry guns. I knew I shouldn't have been selling drugs. So then once my child was born, my father left when I was in the 3rd grade, and I wanted to be there for him. So when I had him, I said, I really got to get out of here now. I could be this drug hero, or I could actually change my life.
So unlike many with his upbringing and background, he went on to completely transform and change his life and wound up becoming one of the top executives in the NYPD. where you got a different perspective on the link between violence and criminal organizations?
Well, in my experience, and I was an executive in the biggest police department in the United States. Most of the crime, like the hardcore crime, the killings, are really coming from gangs. And all of the gangs are dealing with drugs for the most part. That's how they make their money. The gangs are dealing with drugs. There's not too many people walking down the street and just get shot and killed. Most of the crime is related to drugs. And when I say drugs, I'm talking about hardcore drugs. I haven't seen too many crimes where marijuana was the key to the crime. But crack cocaine, regular cocaine, heroin, oxycodone, these prescription drugs. I've seen cases where these drugs was really linked to the crime. But marijuana, which America is trying to legalize in some shape or form, in my experience in only 21 years, I haven't seen marijuana be a major factor in somebody committing a crime.
So Corey Pegues has seen the drug situation from both sides of the law, having started off as a teenager selling drugs, carrying guns, to changing his life and becoming an NYPD police chief. What were his thoughts, and what are his thoughts on the whole issue of legalizing drugs with an attempt to kind of combat the violence?
I definitely think if you legalize, and marijuana at this point is a no-brainer. If you legalize it, I honestly do not think that it's a major factor in committing crime. I mean, you can see, like, even in New York City now, they have decriminalized locking up somebody. If you catch them outside with a bag of marijuana in their pocket, no longer are they putting them in jail. They're just giving them a summons to come to court 30 days later and answer for it. And it hasn't been a major increase in giving people marijuana summonses, So before, they was just putting these young kids in jail, putting them through the system, and they was getting arrest records. No longer, they're not doing that no longer, and crime hasn't gone up. So it shows. I mean, just that little change in marijuana shows there are less arrests for marijuana, a lot less. They was doing thousands and thousands of arrests, where now they're giving out summonses here and there, and it's probably not even a lot of summonses. So I think definitely legalizing the marijuana, because if you legalize it, then you take the secrecy out of the drug dealers. If you could go to the corner store and get a bag of weed for $5, the drug dealer can't sell it to you for $10. Hardcore drugs such as crack cocaine, heroin, cocaine itself, I do believe we should enforce those drugs, because those drugs, they really decimate families. I definitely don't think we should legalize crack cocaine, because we saw the effects of what that drugs did in the 80s, and we saw the effects of heroin in the 70s. We don't want to go back to that, and we definitely don't want the government being the source to having. But marijuana, I'm all for legalizing it. If you look at the state of Colorado out here, they legalized marijuana, and they have such a surplus of money, they don't even know what to do with the money.
So he is in favour of legalising things like marijuana, possibly decriminalising other harder drugs, but kind of steps back from legalising them across the board, because he has seen the negative impact that some of the harder drugs have on communities and have on people. And I put the same question towards Dr Mark Thornton. I wanted to know, from his perspective, would he be in favour of legalising all drugs across the board?
Yes, I would. I think that, commercial production of these products and having corporations have liability for their products would make the products much, much, much safer. Decriminalization has been in effect in Portugal since 1997, and things have improved very much in Portugal with respect to overdoses and HIV transmission, and a variety of other social indicators have improved under decriminalization. But I think that under legalization, where you have commercial production, you might have medical supervision, things of that nature, I think that the results would be even better. So I think we can take the leap right now of legalizing marijuana for recreational as well as medical reasons. And I think we can also look into legalizing the harder drugs with commercial oversight and maybe medical supervision to get the current addicts off of the streets, out of crime, and working to get rid of their addiction. I think that presents the clearest, fastest way of solving, or at least improving the situation in terms of all of the social cost associated with addiction to illegal drugs as well as to legal drugs. We have a big legal drug problem, so legalization is not going to wipe these issues away, but what we're looking at is very much an improvement and a benefit to society.
But if drugs are legalized, are criminal organizations involved in the drug trade going to actually stop using violence? Well, here's what Dr. Thornton thinks about that.
Oh, yes. I mean, Walmart doesn't use weapons to, protect their market. Companies don't use violence to enforce their contract. It's all within the legal justice system based on the rule of law. And so it's only when you have, like when the crack market opened up in the United States and it was extremely profitable, there was all sorts of violence to enforce contracts and to protect marketing territories and things of that nature by the drug gangs. But life would be entirely different in a system of legal, commercial environment rather than the black market environment. You simply don't have to resort to violence in order to market your products, to enforce contracts, and things of that nature. So like we saw in the United States in 1933 when alcohol prohibition was repealed, we had a return to normalcy in the United States, and all of the violence and corruption and crime, it didn't completely disappear because it only addresses that particular market. But if you lived in an urban area during alcohol prohibition, you would hear regularly, even in good places and nice neighborhoods, you would hear gunfire at night as a result of the black market. So that part would go away.
So there's a lot of strong evidence out there to suggest that legalizing drugs could definitely help reduce the violence that you see on the streets in Dublin and Ireland and all across the world. But why haven't we actually considered doing that yet here in this country? And to help me answer that question, I met up with Irish economist and Irish author David McWilliams. I met him upstairs in a bookshop out in Dalkey, and he brought his dog Sasha with him. So if you hear any weird slobbering, it may be me, but it may also be the dog. Here's what he thinks as to why we haven't yet taken serious steps towards legalizing drugs in an attempt to kind of prevent violence.
I think because there is a skewed morality around drug taking. So, for example, our recent Taoiseach was not happy to be, but celebrated the fact that he'd be out boozing all the time. Right. The last fella, right? And getting hammered and going on the radio hammered and all that sort of stuff, right? Which is unusual to say the least, right? And we celebrate alcohol in this country. In actual fact, what I've noticed as I get older, it certainly wasn't the case when I was much younger, but now being Irish is synonymous with boozing. And that really wasn't, when I was a kid, it was always the case, but wasn't celebrated. So, for example, when Obama arrives, we give him a pint of stout. A lot of people say, you might as well give him a line of Coke. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's kind of ridiculous.
He was in Colombia.
But the interesting thing is, do the Colombians give him a line of Coke? They don't.
No.
Right?
Yeah.
So, my sense is that we have a very bizarre relationship with drugs. We've got to accept the fact that prohibition has not worked. I believe, as an economist looking at the society and as a citizen of the country, that it has created more problems than it has solved. And I think the future generations, and I really believe this, like in 100 years, people look back and say, you did what? You put all these kids in prison, you had huge police presence on the streets, and junkies were shoplifting and robbing all the time, and you gave all the proceeds of these drugs to criminals, and then you policed them, and then they started killing people. People look back and say, did that actually happen? Was that for real?
So would you be in favour of eventually moving towards full legalisation for all drugs or decriminalisation?
Well, I believe this is semantics. I think that, I think people say, decriminalisation sounds kind of better than legalisation. I just think, look, there is a role for the state to protect the citizen. Okay, but we're here in Dalkey. We're here in anywhere in any town in Dublin will have licensed vintners, as they're called, right? Which actually give out booze, and the quality of that booze is monitored by all sorts of things. So you can't serve, alcohol that's 90% because people don't want to have it. In the main, I think that in time we will get to the same situation with respect to drugs. I think it's a sort of a wishy-washy argument as to whether you decriminalise or legalise. But clearly you have to start by decriminalising. Yeah. I think that people who end up in prison for small time drug dealing, it's kind of pathetic, and it's a cost to society, and it's a waste. It's a waste for everybody. And the problem is, you come back to the fundamental issue, Cormac, which is, why do people take drugs? Why have people historically? Why, for example, did the Vikings take magic mushrooms? Why do all these things?
Yeah.
It's because, for some reason, human beings seem to like messing with their heads.
Yeah.
Okay, as a general rule. So you have dance culture, you have clubs, you have all this sort of thing. And it seems to me that the political establishment are quite happy to celebrate drinking, kind of in a sort of irresponsible way, but have a certain amount of massive hypocrisy when it comes to drug taking. I also believe that will change. I think the interesting thing about Ireland is if you look, when I was a kid, there were three things that Ireland held dear. And this is what I think is quite funny. Ireland is a country that's incredibly capable of abandoning core beliefs, right? So when I was a kid, there was, I'm much older than you, Cormac, there was Article 2 and 3, which was a claim to Northern Ireland.
Right.
And that was regarded, when I was a kid, as sort of, that's sacrosanct, it's part of the Constitution, and we want the North. Okay. There was the other thing was the aspiration to speak the Irish language.
Yeah.
That was, this is defined. And the third thing was the Catholic Church. Now, as I have grown older, we voted 96% of us abandoned Article 2 and 3. So that was a core belief we just got rid of. The Catholic Church is gone, as far as I can see. And finally, the Irish language was never really an aspiration. So these core beliefs in societies, and particularly in this society, Ireland is very good at throwing away core beliefs. Right? We actually stand for nothing. That's the interesting thing. And I've always thought that's quite a good thing. It's quite a modern thing, standing for nothing. It's like, oh, that's interesting because, it's not heroic, but it's interesting that these big things are abandoned.
Yeah.
And I think in this country, if you look at the statistics for drug taking and just generally Irish carry on, we're off the scale in the European context. Irish people smoke more weed, they take more E, they certainly seem to do as much Charlie as the Brits. The last statistics are. So let's deal with it.
So even on that, coming from, I suppose, an economics point of view as well, if you legalise it, I'd imagine increase the supply of it and increase the consumption.
Well, you mightn't. And this is the interesting thing, is that, go back to prohibition. Were there more alcoholics in the United States in the 30s, when prohibition was abandoned, in the 40s, than there were in the 20s? No. So there's always going to be a small amount of people, and we all know them, who can't stop. The vast majority of people self-regulate. I really believe this. There are some really, really bad cases, and heroin seems to me to be the drug that you've got to be most careful with, because we all know, I know one or two friends who have fallen really badly with heroin, whose lives have been destroyed by heroin. My question has always been to myself with regard to this discussion was whether more people would have their lives destroyed by heroin if it were legal. So the question I've always asked myself is, did these guys, they're two lads, two middle-aged men at this stage, were they incentivized to take drugs because it was illegal, in the sense that there was a kind of a whiff of sulfur off it? Or if drugs were legal, would more people become junkies? I think if you look at the prohibition situation, it's very clear that the United States had no increase in alcoholism when supply was increased. And that comes back to personal choice.
Yeah, I suppose there's other issues as opposed to supply that are going to make someone...
When you start to analyse something like the war on drugs, you've got to say, okay, is it working? And does working mean there's less drugs on the streets, there's less kids taking drugs, there's less criminality? So you look at that and you say, and there's less supply. From what I can see, there's more supply, there's more kids taking drugs, there's more profits going to criminals, so change the system.
So speaking of analysing a drugs market, as you are well aware, getting accurate data, information and evidence from an underground black market is incredibly difficult, which means it's incredibly difficult to sometimes try and make informed policy decisions. But back in 2014, one of the most comprehensive pieces of research was published into the illicit drug market in Ireland that had never been done before. The report was trying to take an evidence-based approach to the situation at hand and was highlighting the negatives, but also the positives that the drug markets actually bring to this country. Things like, in deprived areas, drug markets actually bring a form of income and employment to deprived families. So rather than take the sensationalist view that the newspaper and the tabloids take about gangland shootings and gangland killings, what is the market itself actually doing? The study took 36 months to complete. It looked at over 1,200 cases from An Garda Síochána. It spoke to current people in prison serving more than 7 years for dealing drugs. It spoke to current addicts, current dealers working on the streets, reformed addicts, reformed dealers, and also surveyed 816 people who are local residents in communities that have been ravaged by drug dealing. The study was undertaken by Anne-Marie Donovan and Dr Johnny Connolly. And we're going to jump into an interview now that I had with Dr Johnny Connolly, where I'm asking him about his views based on the evidence that he researched on whether Ireland should decriminalise drugs or just come out and adopt a full legalisation.
One of the things I found from the illicit drug market study is that not all drugs and not all drug markets are equally harmful. Some involve young people, some involve the open dealing of crack cocaine, some involve people in school smoking dope or smoking cannabis or experimenting with cannabis. And all of these require different interventions and different responses. Obviously, if you've got open, and I've seen this, if you've got open crack dealing taking place, in a shopping mall, where people are coming and going and young people are coming and going and people with their children are coming and going every day, that shouldn't be allowed to happen.
Right.
That has to be targeted. And even if it is disrupted, or even if it is pushed around the corner, which is inevitably what will happen once the demand is still there, that's better than it being visible and young people seeing it as a normal affair.
Okay,
so I think that's where we have to start, is looking at what are we trying to achieve in a harm reduction strategy, and what is the role of the criminal law in that area. And I would say it's quite minimal. Now, drugs are illegal, as many drugs are illegal, so it's a criminal offence. What does that achieve, really? Criminalising somebody who's possibly experimenting with drugs, what does that achieve? They have a criminal record. It could lead them into more serious drug use. It could stigmatise them, prevent them getting visas, prevent them getting employment. So, in a way, pushing them into more problematic behaviour. So, I don't really see the logic of criminalising this sort of behaviour. Personal use, simple possession for personal use. I don't see the logic in that. And, the guards, again, will be the first to admit that all they can really do is disrupt the trade, given the level of demand that is there. They can, and on many occasions, and I spoke to people, I spoke to guards, I spoke to drug dealers, and law enforcement has a very minimal impact on the availability of drugs. We don't, of course, it's an illegal market, so we don't really know what impact it has. But a recent UN report suggested that law enforcement in Ireland intercepted less than 5% of the heroin that was available. So, that might be right, it might be wrong. The Gardaí disagree with that figure, but they don't come up with a counter figure because they don't have it. But a report I once encountered in the UK, it was leaked report by the British government, suggested that you would need to intercept 80% of what was available to have any real impact on availability. Now, no country has come anywhere near that. It's not just an Irish situation. No country has come near that except for the Taliban, actually, in Afghanistan. So you want to go down that road. So that requires that we must prioritise. We must prioritise resources and determine what exactly is the role of law enforcement within a harm reduction strategy. And when we take that approach to it, I think you have to look at the role of law enforcement in harm reduction. It's not just about seizing drugs, it's not just about statistics, it's about directly having a role in diverting people into treatment. And in, like, one of the examples of decriminalisation that I think is a positive example is the Portuguese experiment, because, it's not an experiment anymore, it's been there since 1990. But what they have done is that they have decriminalised drugs within the context of a harm reduction strategy. So they've taken people out of the criminal system. It's still illegal, drugs are still illegal, but they've diverted them away from the criminal justice system. Now, with regards to legalisation, I think, in a way, the argument about legalisation, often there's a lot of confusion between decriminalisation and legalisation, and it's good that you've made that distinction, because often people don't realise that there is a distinction. But I would see decriminalisation going in the direction of a regulated trade, but decriminalisation is a good place to start.
Right.
It's very difficult to support legalisation because it's never been tried anywhere. You do see experiments in the United States and in many other countries who are legalising weed or legalising marijuana. Now, if you take an approach like that, just look, say, at the inner city here. Now, for many people, there isn't this distinction in the market between cannabis and cocaine. In many other parts of society, there would be.
Right.
So the links between the different drugs within the market, they overlap in many occasions. So I think you'd have to be extremely careful and, extremely clear about what it is you're trying to do when you're regulating. But I think decriminalisation is a good step forward within a harm reduction approach. And that's what the focus must be on always, the harms people are doing to themselves and to broader society.
Someone else who I spoke to about this as well was a gentleman named Dr Mark Thornton, who did he's an economics professor and did a PhD into looking at the economics of the prohibition era with regards to alcohol. I asked him, and the one thing that I didn't really agree with him too much, I'd love to get your opinion on it, is, let's say hypothetically tomorrow illicit drugs were suddenly made legal and you had to set up as a business or whatever and it became legal. Do you think that crime organisations that have the infrastructure in place that hypothetically all of a sudden become legal, do you think that they would stop resorting to violence to protect their territory? Because he commented that if they were legal, you wouldn't need violence anymore because they'd enforce contracts through the courts and the law. But my only thinking is that if you're a criminal organisation that has been nearly specialising in violence as a means to increase your market share, do you think legalising drugs would prevent criminal organisations from resorting to violence?
I think it would have to have some impact. Now, for most criminal organisations, violence is not good for business. It is sometimes applied, or what's referred to as systemic violence is sometimes applied, for debt collection, because of territorial disputes, etc. But it's generally bad for business. The violence that we're seeing at the moment in Dublin and in recent months, that's at a very high level, and it's possibly because it's family related. But in general, it's not in the interests of those at high levels in the drug trade for this to go on, because law enforcement, it attracts their attention, it attracts political priority, which it doesn't usually do. And if it's just people, in the inner city who don't vote, generally are low voting rates, it doesn't attract the political priorities that it does when people are being clearly shot in the streets or in a visible, in the way we've seen it so visibly. So in a way, it'd be, where does the violence arise? I mean, talking about prohibition, it's interesting because at a time, for example, when the mafia controlled the various trades, they were far more organised because these groups were well organised. That they had their own internal disciplinary mechanisms, and so you didn't have that violence spilling over. When a market is disrupted, then you will see greater levels of violence emerging. And we have seen increasing levels of violence associated with the Irish drug trade since around 2004, probably around that sort of area. And it is possibly in the wake of the whole focus on Veronica Guerin, the disruption of the various people who were involved at senior levels in the trade, the emergence of younger people more willing to use violence. And then you have this sort of a criminal approach, or a criminal law approach that is about imposing increasingly draconian criminal measures, such as the mandatory sentencing legislation, for example. Now, what that does is it forces the market to adapt to this. So now you're not going to have drug dealers holding on to drugs. They're going to find other means. And what happens sometimes, say if you look at say Mexico as an example, what that type of enforcement, when the government upped the war basically against Mexican cartels, that encourages the risk averse coming to the top, basically, people who are prepared to respond with violence. Right. Again, it's like the unintended consequence of more stringent law enforcement. It encourages the risk averse from entering into the trade. Now, if you take the drug trade from large criminal organisations, of course there will be they will move into other areas. But I would think it would have to have an impact in terms of the violence. I think it would have to reduce it. It won't necessarily end their criminal enterprise, but I think it would have to have an impact on the drug trade as a whole. One of the interesting things here about the head shop phenomenon, that it was sometimes said, I know it was probably rumoured, that the drug trade were losing business to the head shops, and they clearly were, because many people, there was a study done subsequently following the laws that were introduced in 2010, and they found that many people, dependent drug users, had moved over to head shop products because they found them more reliable and easier to access, basically. Once the head shops were closed, they moved back. And also, we know, because a lot of the people who were running the head shops were paying their taxes. Right. And we saw the sort of revenue that they were making. There was a building burnt down in Capel Street, and there was something like $500,000 found in the safe in the cellar. So they were making big money. That money was coming from the drug trade, basically. So inevitably, it's going to have an impact on the drug trade, and they might respond. There will still be some form of regulation, so there will still be dealers. There will still be stronger, if they introduce a certain quality or a certain, grade of drugs, there will always be people supplying a stronger grade, etc. So there will still be, I would imagine, there would still be, this is all speculation, of course, there would still be an illegal trade, you would assume, but I think it would have to be less violent. I think it would have to be one of the consequences of it. And then, you have to look at what might the other consequences be. Would it lead to a greater levels of use if it was done properly? I think it might not. So it's something that policymakers would really have to think very deep. I think we have a lot of other things we have to do first. We have to focus on demand reduction, on education, on engaging, as I mentioned, engaging with people where they are at. We have to focus on harm reduction, particularly for those who are, seriously dependent drug users who are, for example, injecting drugs in laneways around Dublin and elsewhere. We have to think about safe injecting facilities as an idea and engage with it as an idea, and increasingly that is being done. Decriminalisation is now on the agenda. So those are very positive developments, I think, and it's people being mature and looking at the thing that this is a problem. It hasn't gone away since the drug strategy started. It's getting worse in many respects. So we have to, a sensible, logical, rational Democrats, we have to engage with this, and policymakers must engage with the evidence and the reality.
So I asked the same question to David McWilliams. Legalising drugs, would it legitimise criminal organisations, or would it just put an end to their violent trade and put them out of business?
As far as I can see in Dublin, there are very few people selling booze on the side of the street.
Right.
So take booze as being exactly the same as drugs in the sense that people want it or whatever, right? My sense is that criminal gangs will do something else. Crime's always there.
Yeah.
People always want to make a few quid illicitly. That's just the deal. But I can't see, if you take booze as the template, how criminal gangs could benefit from a situation where drugs are legally made available by the state. You know, I really can't. But you know, it's interesting. Again, I go back to the States where there was a prohibition and a sort of an anti-booze crusade. People who sold publicans, and I speak as the grandson of a publican, right? People who sold booze were regarded as, you know, morally a little bit dodgy.
Yeah.
You know, that's not that long ago. So my sense is that we've got to be realistic about our society. We've also got to stop taking the view that people who take drugs recreationally are morally suspect. I have worked with lots and lots of people at very, very high levels who are really very, very brilliant, who go out on a Friday and a Saturday night and get off their heads. And that's life. And I have no moral qualms about working with them, being, you know, writing with them, doing television with them, writing books with them, doing speeches with them, you know. So I think we've got to really change the establishment's relationship with significant proportion of citizens in Ireland who take drugs. I really do.
How would you see in the next year full legalisation came into Ireland with regards to Class A drugs? How do you see it being sold or obtained? You know what I mean? Is it like a pub where you can go in and get a drink, or are they selling lines?
I think we have pharmacies that exist which sell Class A drugs very expensively. These are technical issues that are very simple to sell. I mean, all you're basically saying is, how would drugs be sold? I did a one-man show in the Abbey about 5 years ago. And the Abbey Theatre is on the intersection of Marlborough Street and Abbey Street. And I went there every morning about 9 a.m. to practice. And I looked out the window every morning. And that crossroads is like the Wire. The junkies arrive at around 9 or 10, queuing up. Two lads arrive in, one lad with a bag of smack and one lad with a bag of money. I swear to God, you've got to go and see it. And the fella takes the money, the other guy gives out the smack. It's extraordinary. It is like a bazaar for drugs. And it's not just smack, it's pills and uppers and downers and all sorts of stuff, right? And medical pills, stuff that are originally come from the pharmaceutical industry. And it's like a shop. And the cops probably turn a blind eye, it seems to me, because it's so open. And you've got little old Dublin grannies going around their business, you know, with their little trolleys. And so drug dealing happens in the open in Ireland. We have to accept that. And I think it would be better if that was controlled by the state and taxed. And I believe that some of the revenue, and this is the important thing, could go to drug rehabilitation. See, at the moment what we have is, if you know people, particularly heroin addicts, what you realise is that their lives are made doubly miserable. A, they're addicts, which is a disaster. Horrible, horrible drug, like alcoholics. But B, there's so little state money into rehabilitation. So I believe if we were to decriminalise drugs, or in some way reorganise the way we sell drugs, a lot of the revenues of that could go to try and weaning people off, right? And again, I come back to the idea that of 100 people who recreationally take drugs, a very small minority become addicts. That's the case. Yeah. And they have nowhere to go. So I think that if you talk to Peter McVerry, if you talk to, you know, any of the charities working with addicts in town, they're totally strapped for cash. And so maybe it's a more humane way is to accept the fact that this happens, to organise yourselves as a society and eliminate the criminal element, and then to use some of the revenues from that to try and wean people off, rather than say, we have a war on drugs, we're going to stop it, when we know, you and I, Cormac, know that it hasn't worked.
So it does sound great. A lot of evidence to suggest that, you know what, there's problems out there. Legalising drugs may help the addicts, and it may help society reduce the violent crime that's spilling out onto the streets. The only thing in the back of my mind as an Irish person is, could we handle drugs? Honestly, seriously, could we actually handle drugs if they were made legal and freely available to everyone? Yeah, there's going to be some positive benefits, but I don't think as Irish people we understand the meaning of moderation. We're a nation of indulgers. We go mad. 1 or 2 on a Friday night generally leads to a 4-day bender. You wake up in a ditch with no pants, wondering how in the name of God you got here. So is our culture and our society mature enough and ready enough to take on more substances that would be freely available. Here's what Dr. Johnny Connolly thought about that.
I think there is a cultural issue there, certainly, and a policy has to be culturally sensitive.
Yeah.
And I think we do have to think about that. Our relationship with alcohol is problematic. As I think a comedian put it, my name is Ireland, I'm an alcoholic. and in a way, I think we do have to think about that. And how would, a greater availability of other substances, how would that be reacted to? How would young people see it? But often really, and a lot of research shows this, that it isn't really the criminal status of the drug that determines whether a young person is going to engage with it or not. It's often what their peers think. And so it's not the criminal status of it really that is often the key problem. One of the things I mentioned at the beginning about this idea of drug dealers preying on children at the school gates, as to say, nearly all research I'm familiar with show that 80% of people first experiment with drugs with their friends or family members, or first introduced to drugs by a friend or a family member. That's where the intervention and the prevention has to go. It isn't meeting a drug dealer. It is being a brother, a sister, a close friend in school, etc. That's where they first start experimenting.
So we Irish do have something to consider when it comes to legalising drugs, our cultural and social background. But the question today was, would legalising drugs help reduce violence? In relation to the drug market, it possibly could. But as all the people who are featured on this podcast have said, listen, crime will always be there. So would you just be shifting violence somewhere else? Would there be a net reduction of violence in society? And if not, well, what would be the point then? But I think one thing is certain, that by having an all-out offensive and an all-out war on drugs, you're obviously going to be increasing violence, and sometimes that's going to be coming from the state as well. Take, for example, what's happening in the Philippines right now. Their newly elected president, Robert Duterte, has encouraged his police force to put an end to drugs by any means possible, and has incited a campaign of bloodshed to try and eliminate criminal organisations and drug dealings. Since June last year, when he was elected, 2,555 people have been murdered by police for being suspected of dealing drugs or taking drugs. On top of that, a further 3,603 people have been murdered in unexplained circumstances by what the police are claiming was either gang-related or quote-unquote mysterious vigilante groups taking out the killings. And the violence is getting out of hand in the Philippines right now as well. A recent article on economist.com states this: policemen from the National Drug Squad, including senior officers, falsely accused the South Korean businessman of involvement in narcotics. They hauled him off to a national police headquarters in Manila, demanded ransom from his family, pocketed the money, and then strangled him, burning his body and flushing the ashes down a lavatory. After this scandal broke, a 24-hour pause was put on the violent campaign from the police force, and then locals suddenly reported that there was a massive drop in the quote-unquote vigilante killings of people in local areas. So obviously having a violent war on drugs all around the world is never going to lead to a reduction in violence. It's going to lead to an increase in violence. So maybe we should change the approach. And you know what? Maybe legalising drugs would actually in fact help reduce the violence on all sides, on the criminal organisation side and on the police forces and the state side. But I'd love to know what you think about the issue as well. If you want to get involved in the conversation, drop a comment on Twitter. I'm at P10 podcast. You can also get involved and check out the article online on project10podcast.com. The article will be up there that accompanies this podcast. Will also give links to the articles, the research papers, the resources, and all of the people who I interviewed. All of their links to all their profiles will be available there as well. And again, big thank you to Dr. Mark Thornton, Corey Pegues, David McWilliams, and Dr. Johnny Connolly. Coming up in the next episode, social media influencers.
Hey guys, I'm doing a very exciting collab
to snap you guys today. I
forgot. In Currabin.
Just wants to come on and reveal something.
It is a beautiful day. I am DJing Circus tonight.
And the internet hasn't been great.
What are they? What do they do? How much money do they make? Do they work? Are they effective?
From quota figures in Ireland and the UK for certain influencers, obviously the UK, the figures are insane. One guy was 30 grand for one day to create one YouTube video.
And is it all going to come to a crashing end in 2017?
I know an awful lot of brands are getting fed up with it. I know an awful lot of ad agencies are getting fed up with it.
That episode will be out in about 2 weeks' time. I'm going to be speaking to some very interesting people, marketing experts, social media experts, beauty bloggers, people who call themselves influencers themselves. And also be trying to explore the reason why we as humans love influencing and manipulating each other on a daily basis so much. So that episode will be out in about 2 weeks' time. If you want to know exactly when it'll be out, sign up to the mailing list on project10podcast.com and also follow us on and on Twitter, and you'll be notified straight away. Until then, this has been episode 1 of the Project 10 podcast series. I'm Cormac Moore, and I will speak to you in the next episode.